Ignored, abandoned, unseen. Until one night, the neighbor next door asked, "Are you okay?" And just like that, everything changed.
偉そう。今の稼ぎに合わないね。フリーライターでやめてもらうからね。嫌なら出てってよ。ここは私の会社の借り上げ社宅なんだからさ。もういい。お風呂空いてる？部屋禁煙、外ですって。
こんばんは。
あ、こんばんは。お酒ですか？
あ、寝れなくて。お蕎麦美味しかったです。
あ、お前また酒飲んだ？
うん、ちょっと。
ほどほどにしろよ。
She wasn't looking to cheat. She was just looking to feel alive again.
失礼します。
But secrets always come with a price. And one night, the truth came home.
Oh, なんで起こしてくれなかったんだよ。月曜会議だって言ってるだろ。
ごめんなさい。ご飯。
いらないよ、そんな食べてる暇ないから。じゃあ、ごめん。
夕飯は？
メールする。じゃあ。
Have you ever loved someone so much that you didn't even realize you were slowly disappearing? Saeko thought she was one of the lucky ones. The kind of woman who found her person early in life. The kind who didn't have to swipe left or right, didn't have to question red flags, because John's her college sweetheart had always been kind, responsible, loving. He knew how she liked her tea. He remembered the dates she feared and the songs that calmed her down. Their love wasn't explosive. It was gentle, familiar, safe. So when she graduated, saying yes to his proposal felt like the most natural thing in the world. But nobody talks about what happens when safe turns into silent. When the man who once held your hand tightly starts letting it go, ... A little more each day. At first, she thought it was the stress. Johns had just taken a job, a new tech firm, long hours, tight deadlines. It was understandable. She made excuses for him to their friends, to herself. He's just tired. He's building a future for us. He still loves me. I know he does. But days turned into months. The late nights became normal. The silence, louder than any argument they'd ever had. No. How was your day? No gentle kiss on the forehead before bed. Just ... nothing. Saeko began to feel like a ghost in her own home. A woman wrapped in pretty dresses with no one to see them. She waited. She hoped. Then she stopped hoping. She started pouring a glass of wine with dinner, then another before bed. She stopped trying to talk. What was the point? One day, she stood on her balcony alone, staring at the empty space where her husband used to be. And that's when she noticed them, the new couple who had just moved into the apartment next door. They looked annoyingly perfect. Their presence was like a mirror, reflecting everything Saeko had lost. She turned away, heart sinking. A deep sigh escaped her lips, thick with wine and something heavier grief. But that night, something changed. Around midnight, she stepped out for air again. She wasn't expecting company, but there he was, Gary, the man next door. He stood silently on his own balcony, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. The soft orange tip flickered like a signal in the dark. He glanced her way, nodded. Rough night? Saeko blinked. She hadn't heard a real voice in hours. You could say that, she replied, managing a small, tired smile. Same here, he said, exhaling smoke into the damp night. Felt like the walls were closing in. There was a long silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was mutual, like two strangers carrying invisible weights, recognizing the heaviness in each other. Saeko didn't ask what happened between him and his wife. She didn't need to. Pain doesn't always need translation. She understood too well. The thing no one warns you about marriage is how isolating it can become when love turns one-sided. When the person who once made you feel whole forgets you're even there. Saeko wasn't looking to betray anyone. She was just trying to remember what it felt like to be seen. And Gary, maybe he was doing the same. So when she watched him hold his wife's hand in public, but argue with her behind closed doors, when she saw the cracks beneath their polished surface, it didn't make her feel vindicated. It made her feel less crazy, less alone. Because maybe, just maybe not all love stories are as perfect as they look from across the hall. And sometimes, broken hearts find each other in the quietest, most unexpected ways. She didn't know where this strange connection was headed, but in that moment, on a quiet balcony beneath a cloudy sky, Saeko didn't feel invisible anymore. And that was the beginning of everything. That night, Johns came home. No warning. No "I miss you" text. Just the sound of the front door unlocking and his briefcase hitting the floor. Saeko had waited up, her hair brushed, a soft blouse instead of pajamas, some small, desperate attempt to reconnect. For once, she hoped he'd notice, say something, touch her. But he barely looked her way. "Dinner's in the fridge," she said quietly. "Already ate," he replied, walking past her like she was a piece of furniture. She stood there for a few seconds, swallowing the sting. "I was thinking maybe we could talk for a bit. Just about anything." He opened his laptop at the dining table, not even turning around. "I've got emails to catch up on. Tomorrow?" It was like being splashed with cold water. Again. So she turned to the one thing that never asked questions wine. She sat on the balcony with her glass, head leaning against the cool metal rail, wondering how her marriage had become this empty. And just like a scene she'd lived before, Gary was out there again. He didn't speak at first, just flicked his cigarette, eyes quietly scanning her expression. "You okay?" he asked after a long pause. She hesitated, then shrugged. "You ever feel like you're screaming inside, but no one hears you?" He nodded. "Every damn day." The next afternoon, Saeko stepped out of a cab, juggling grocery bags and a small box of books she'd borrowed from a friend. Her arms trembled from the weight. The sun was beating down hard, and all she wanted was to make it up the stairs without collapsing. And then Gary, he appeared out of nowhere, jogging toward her. Before she could object, he took half the load from her hands. She gave a faint smile. There was something in the way he said, like he wasn't just talking about groceries. He followed her to the door, and she fumbled with her keys. "Want some water?" she asked, surprised at herself. He hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, just for a minute." The air inside her apartment was still, like everything had been holding its breath for weeks. She poured 2 glasses, and they sat down on the sofa. Not close, not far, just ... there. At first, they talked about nothing. Work, weather, the weird neighbor with too many cats. But slowly, the surface-level chatter gave way to silence, and then to truth. I used to think love was about finding the perfect person, Gary said softly. But now I think it's about fighting to stay connected when life tries to pull you apart. Saeko stared into her glass. I stopped fighting a long time ago. Why? Because I didn't think anyone was on the other side anymore. He looked at her then, not just at her face, but through it, into the part of her that still longed to be loved, to be chosen. "You're not invisible," he whispered. "You're kind and strong and real. I see you." Her breath caught in her throat. No one had said something like that to her in years. And that's when it happened. He reached for her hand. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't impulsive. It was gentle, like a bridge built between 2 people who were drowning on separate islands. "I know we both have lives, responsibilities, people who depend on us," he said, his voice low and honest. "But when I'm near you, I feel like I can breathe again." Saeko blinked back tears. "I don't know what this is." "I don't either," he interrupted. "But I know it's real." The room went silent again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was full, with possibility, with something forbidden, but alive. They didn't kiss, not yet, but something had shifted. What started as quiet sympathy had become something deeper, something electric and terrifying. And somehow, despite all the lines they knew they shouldn't cross, their hearts had already stepped over. Saeko woke up to something she hadn't felt in a long time like this. Johns had kissed her on the cheek that morning. It wasn't much, but it was something. And after all the silence, all the distant dinners and cold nights, she clung to it like a flicker of hope. Maybe he noticed her again. Maybe he realized what they were losing. Maybe it wasn't too late. She cooked that night, real food, set the table, even lit a candle. And when Johns walked in, she smiled wide, heart trembling with fragile optimism. But he just looked at the candle, blinked, and mumbled, "I already ate." Again, the silence swallowed the room whole. Saeko sat down alone, spooning lukewarm soup into her mouth as tears silently slid down her face. That night, Gary messaged her. Just 2 words. "You okay?" She stared at the screen, biting her lip. And then she replied, "No." Minutes later, a knock at her door. When she opened it, he didn't speak. He didn't ask for permission. He just saw her eyes red, shoulders heavy, and wrapped his arms around her like it was the most natural thing in the world. And in that moment, she collapsed into him. Every inch of sadness, every year of loneliness, every quiet scream that had never found a place to land poured out of her and into his chest. She wasn't thinking anymore. She wasn't calculating. She was just feeling. They sat together in her living room for what felt like hours. No expectations, no plans. Just 2 broken hearts finally finding warmth. And then they fell in love with each other. Slow, hesitant, like they were both asking, "Is this okay? Are we allowed?" But the moment they touched, It felt inevitable, not rushed, not wild, but deeply, achingly needed. He held her like she was something precious, something he'd waited years to touch gently, and she melted into it, feeling for the first time in years what it meant to matter to someone. They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. Their bodies spoke in silences and sighs, in the language of two people starving for affection, for understanding. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual. And Gary looked at her like she wasn't a mistake or a temptation, but a person, a partner, a soul he'd been waiting to find. They didn't talk about tomorrow, or consequences, or guilt, because in that space, those few stolen hours, they found a version of themselves that life had buried. And slowly, it became routine. They started finding reasons to meet. A walk, a coffee, a shared glance in the hallway. It wasn't just passion, it was comfort, trust, joy. But each moment brought more weight, more fear. Because love that isn't allowed always carries shadows. Still, Saeko couldn't let go. The more Johns drifted into his work, the more she ran toward Gary. And Gary, despite the marriage he was quietly unraveling, kept meeting her in the middle. They weren't just cheating, they were escaping. From emptiness, from silence, from years of feeling like nothing more than a background character in someone else's life. But deep down, both of them knew this story couldn't stay in the dark forever. No matter how gently they touched, no matter how softly they loved, the truth was coming. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same. She told herself it had to stop. Every time Saeko looked at herself in the mirror, guilt clung to her like fog. So she avoided Gary, but the loneliness came rushing back with a vengeance. John's, still busy, still cold, still in the same house, but never really there. And just like that, Saeko crumbled. No explanations, no guilt tripping. Just the soft ache of two people who couldn't let each other go. She found her happiness in him, and in that happiness, she forgot everything else, forgot the rules, forgot the rings, forgot the woman she once promised to be. Weeks passed like that. They stole time like thieves' afternoons when no one was home, nights when the world slept, moments when everything wrong somehow felt right. But nothing secret lasts forever. One evening, everything came crashing down. It was late. Saeko was curled up in Gary's arms, the sound of soft music drifting from the speaker. Her guard was down, her heart wide open. Neither of them heard the door to her apartment open. Johns had come home early. The first thing he noticed was her shoes still by the door. Then the faint murmur of a voice, laughter, a man's voice. He walked slowly toward the sound, confusion tightening into something colder. There she was, in another man's arms. Everything stopped. Time, breathing, thought. Gary jumped up. Saeko froze. Johns didn't shout, didn't curse. He just stared eyes wide, heart shattering quietly inside his chest. It was like the air had been sucked from the room. Johns looked at Gary, then back at his wife, and his face twisted with something between pain and disbelief. There was no hiding, no excuse, just truth, laid bare like broken glass. Johns didn't wait for an answer. He turned, walked out, and just like that, the door closed. This wasn't just a secret being exposed. This was a life unraveling. She stopped pretending. For the first time, she faced herself. Not with Gary, not with her husband. Just her. But somewhere in all that pleasing, she had lost herself. What happened with Gary wasn't just about betrayal, it was about desperation. It was the hunger to be held, to be chosen, to be seen. But choices have consequences. Even the softest love, when born in shadow, leaves scars. In the weeks that followed, Saeko began to rebuild. She didn't blame Johns. She didn't cling to Gary. She had been trying to fill her emptiness with someone else's warmth. But real healing comes from within. Because sometimes the most painful endings are the ones that finally bring us home to ourselves. If you've ever felt invisible in your own story, this is your sign to start writing a new chapter. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.